Hello and welcome back, everybody. Last time we met, we got to this point on World War I. I want to continue our study online, and then tomorrow we'll be meeting live through Zoom. Please join us, and I've got some upcoming announcements about assignments and other opportunities. So yes, this is where we're going to start, the 1918 flu pandemic. I know that you are currently in a pandemic. It is not the first one. It is one of many. Pandemic, remember, just means that it's worldwide. As the war kind of came to a close, there was another tragedy. Not only the deaths that had been on the battlefield, but now civilians and soldiers were dying from a flu pandemic. So this concept of mask wearing that we see so prevalent was also in this one. Closing of things, limiting the groups that could come together, again, all 100 years ago plus. We estimate somewhere between 50 and 100 million people die because of the flu. So again, not deaths on the battlefield. They have been horrific, but now regular folks are dying. We often call it the Spanish flu because Spain is reporting on this. They are a neutral country. The other allied countries had kind of gotten together, and they basically decided not to publish things in the paper very much about the flu because they didn't want to hurt morale and they didn't want people to know how bad it was. And because Spain was actually reporting numbers and the truth, it comes out as the Spanish flu. Well, here's the date. The 11th of November, the 11th month, on the 11th day at the 11th hour, an armistice was signed and fighting would cease. This is not a peace treaty. This is the stopping of conflict. The Germans realize that they're being pushed back to their borders, and this will give them a chance to negotiate. It's kind of interesting. Recently, some audio tape came to light that was recording at the very end of the war. So I want us to listen as the war ends and listen what you can hear in the background when it's over. And so there we go. The guns fall silent. I don't know if you're able to hear on the computer audio, but after the cannons stop, you can hear birds singing in the background. So an armistice is going to be signed. So what about the end of the war? Well, it's not as simple as an armistice being signed and everyone laying down their weapons and returning to normal. No, a lot of things are going to be different in Europe. And so let's walk through some of those today. One of the things that is going to be different is Germany is about to get a new government. Now remember, we saw this with France. We saw how France often was having a revolution and fighting a war and all the things that would happen with it. Well, that's what's about to happen. In November, there are going to be revolutions in Germany, and they're going to end up with a different government than they started the war with. It will be that government, the Weimar Republic, that is created because of this revolution, that will go to the table and will negotiate the peace. They're not the ones that got the war started. After this, the Kaiser will be out, right? So, what happens in this German Revolution was we go from a monarchy to a republic. President Wilson offered peace if the Kaiser abdicated his throne. And the German Supreme Command, facing defeat, decided to send the German Navy into one last battle against the Royal Navy. Well, we saw that already. Now, what eventually happens is the German people realize that they have basically quit a war that they thought they were winning. Sailors actually revolt. Sailors do not want to go into this hopeless battle against the British. And so when your army is no longer following your command, you know that your time is up. And so Kaiser Wilhelm will abdicate on November 9th. They'll stop fighting on November 11th. Well, who now is in charge of Germany? Who is going to take over now that the Kaiser is gone? What is the next government? Well, here they are. The Social Democratic Party. Remember, Germany had not been a democracy. They had been a monarchy with a Kaiser. There are other groups trying to take over. The Spartacus League wants to take Germany into a communist revolution. Remember, we haven't talked a lot about what has happened in the Soviet Union or what used to be Russia, but we will. A lot of people see that Germany is a workers' group, and therefore they should go with the same government that's happening next door to them. Well, the SPD, that Social Democratic Party, makes an agreement with the military, and they put down this communist revolution. So there's a civil war right at the end between Democrats and communists. Remember, Wilson had said he was going to war to make the world safe for democracy. The army and the nationalist militia are sent to the streets to stop this revolution by force, and members of the Spartacus League will be murdered. So these communists, they will be out. So we're going to have a constitution in Germany. That's right, a constitution. This will be their first opportunity to try this, and it will be the Weimar Constitution. You can see communists fighting in the streets there. They will have an elected president. His name is Friedrich Ebert. And so when the war is over, the Kaiser's gone and a president is in power. So France has a president and Germany now has a president. Well, the armistice. There you go. Remember, a suspension of hostilities. Well, let's look at the deaths for just a moment in this war. Many people have died. Look at Russia, for instance. Remember, they are actually out of the war at this point, but they've had a horrendous amount of death. The British Empire, remember, they have sent people to Europe from their different colonies, but they've also been fighting in Africa and Asia and other places. France, well, most of this war was fought on French soil. But Serbians, Romanians, and yes, the United States. While the United States has a large death toll, considering its other wars before this, not as much as what has happened in Europe. So when you kind of lay it out like this way, deaths as percentage of the total troops of a country, you can see that while they were able to mobilize a lot of forces, not as many deaths. And when you get into the Balkan area, you will see that is much more per capita. Total number of soldiers by allied countries. Remember, look at those Russians again. They do not want something like this happening again. And within a few years, within a lifetime of these folks, they'll see another invasion. And we'll talk about that as we get into World War II. So what did the war cost? Well, these are 1914, 1918 dollars. So when you're talking about billions and millions, you're talking about today into the trillions. Notice the United States gets in somewhat late, but spends quite a bit of money. Great Britain, on its own there, has to fend for itself. Russia, not in a long time, but spends a lot of money. And then you can kind of go down the other countries. Yes, Canada gets involved in Australia. I told you that becomes an important part of who they are as people. We even see India and South Africa and British colonies getting involved in this. Well, what did it cost the Central Powers? Again, in 1914, 1918 dollars. Germany spends a fortune on this war. Austria-Hungary spends a fortune and then disappears. Turkey, Bulgaria. So, we often have this quote that war is hell. And just here are some pictures to kind of show you the death and destruction. A man mutilated who'll have to come back and fit back into society. People who have been maimed, farms that have been shelled. They're still pulling shells out of the ground from World War I. There's still places in France you can't go into the woods because there's still explosives in the ground. So what about the sacrifices? Well, if you look closely at these photos, you'll notice that these men are missing limbs. What do they do when they re-enter an industrial society? Well, maybe industrialism can help them. Maybe it can make prosthesis, and that's what the gentleman there is doing, making legs and arms for men so that they can still do a trade or hold down a job, or be able to fit into society. Some 9 million men will die in this war. And there you saw a picture of the American cemetery in the Somme. Actually, dirt from America is sent over there so these boys can be buried in American soil. Some families will have their bodies shipped back, but many will have them buried there because that's where they died and what they were fighting for. And so there's the World War I cemetery. There are 116,000 Americans. So, what about art? You know, we look at a lot of art in this class. So how do you paint war? Do you paint it heroic or horrific? Well, here is John Singer Sargent. He will be sent there to paint some things, and he's got several famous pieces. Here's one, A Street in Arras, which again, you can see the damage and the soldiers sitting around waiting for that next battle. You've got people beginning to push the boundaries of art here, painting no man's land and trench warfare. Those who have lost their names. Again, here are German soldiers going across a field, and they will just be casualties. What about those that have been gassed, the horrific side of war? Or look at this title, Paths of Glory. Is war glorious? Has industrialization and the machine gun and barbed wire and trench warfare taken something out of those charges that we had seen in other wars? And what about here, a German cartoon? Here they are looking at a skeleton, and they're saying it is fit for service. And the joke here is the Germans are running out of people to send to war. And remember, America has just entered the war, therefore there's lots of bodies coming to fight the Germans, and the Germans do not have enough people to keep their army going. Well, in war, there are always all kinds of stories. And this is one that kind of gets hidden somewhat in the war, but it's one that I want to bring out because we're going to talk about genocide, and we've talked about other atrocities. So, the Armenians. Today, this is still controversial in that part of the world. The Armenians live in eastern Turkey. Now, they're a Christian group living in an area controlled by Muslim Turks. And a lot of people began in the Ottoman Empire to think that somehow they're allied with Russia. Remember, Russia is Orthodox Christian. It's the protector of Big Brother Slav. And people began to distrust this group of people living within the empire. So, the Armenian genocide is a deportation of people from the Ottoman Empire, 1915 to 1918. And the Ottoman government is going to charge the Armenians with aiding Russia. So the Ottoman government passed the Techer Law. It gives military authority to deport anyone considered a threat to national security. Laws like this were not uncommon. When you take APUSH, we'll talk about what they were saying about Americans who were disloyal to the war effort. So the Ottomans confiscated the Armenian property, and they basically deported, executed, mass murdered men, women, and children. They would march them outside the city and kill them. This was all done under something called the Committee of Union and Progress. Now remember, we looked at the French Revolution, and many of those things sounded positive. Well, this sounds positive, a Committee of Union and Progress. Well, it was to bring the Ottoman Turks together. That was the union. And the progress was to get rid of these people. I think oftentimes we think of the Holocaust of World War II. Well, this is a genocide of World War I. The actions against the Armenians are directed by the Community of Union and Progress. In February 1915, all military units that are Armenians were demobilized. Their weapons were taken away. And the war minister, Edvan Pasha, justified this because he feared they would fight with the Russians. And so they decided to deport these people. Well, what really happens? Well, the Community of Union and Progress creates a special organization comprised of criminals that had been released to escort these Armenian deportees. They were getting paid to take these people somewhere, but they got paid whether the people showed up or not. And so basically these criminals just turn on the people and kill them and walk away with their money. So the deportees are often massacred and are at the mercy of these criminals. Well, after the war, Turkish court-martials are set up to punish those that were involved. The courts blame the Committee of Union and Progress, that they were the ones behind this. Remember, it's never the people in charge of the government. It was someone at a lower level. The Ottomans did not keep any records of this, and so we're not really sure how many people died in this tragedy. They range anywhere from 300,000 to 1.5 million. That's quite a range, and that's why it's still controversial today. There are monuments to this today in Turkey, but again, they're not always looked at as a positive thing. It's something they had rather forget. Well, what about women in the war? Yes, the war is going to change the way that women are looked at. And if women can do the work, then maybe they should have the vote. And we're going to see women being more participating in politics. So what about women in the war effort? Well, women were encouraged to help finance the war. Here a little girl is being used to say, hey, support my dad at war. We see women here saying, I would love to be in the Navy, but I can't be. Won't you go? But again, women were able to fill some of the roles behind the scenes. They were able to do things that freed up men for war. And remember, there's an incredible amount of men needed to go to those front lines. Here is a women munitions worker, right? She's going to work at a factory. Women are encouraged to come out of the home and to work in factories. Why? Because it frees up men for war. Here are French women working in a factory, producing things for the war effort, keeping their country alive. Here are German women doing the same thing. We'll look at the role of German women when it comes to their next war. Here they are working in the fields, harvesting, right? Making sure that there's enough food. They can drive ambulances. They can do secretarial work. They can do things behind the scenes. Again, it's all the idea of freeing up a man for war. They can be nurses. They can join the auxiliary. Now, again, they will not be in conflict. They're not supposed to be. Today, those rules have changed in a lot of nations. But again, women are seeing the opportunity to do their part. They even will encourage men to join the war. They'll even bully men, basically, to join in the war. Want to know why a good, able-bodied man is not in the military? Russia will send women. Remember, Russia is going to be more equitable when it comes to men and women. And so they're going to have groups to go out and fight. And yes, women are going to serve as spies. We have a famous spy in the war called Mata Hari, right? She's a German spy, and she uses her wily feminine ways to get secrets out of men from other armies and other places. Women, again, they're going to build things. Here is a group of women building ships ready to go to war. Notice this is in America, and notice also it is a racially mixed group, probably a posed photograph. Now, women, don't get shocked. You're wearing pants. Yes, even in the last one, you're wearing pants. The styles for women are changed. Why? Because practicality and safety. So here are women in overalls making wings for airplanes. Women are welding. There they are putting the fins on bombs to be dropped. Again, this new idea of aerial bombardment. Well, traditional female roles used to be raise the children. Well, now it's work for the war effort. So what happens to those kids? Who raises the children? Well, hopefully it's all going to be temporary. And after the war, women are encouraged to quit their jobs and give their job up for a man. Well, we may see that this happens in World War I. In World War II, not as much. And then by the 1950s and 60s, we see women continuing to enter the workforce. So, women were in non-combat roles. Nurses, relief workers. Again, they weren't supposed to be on the front lines. And in this war, the front lines did not change a whole lot, so that was pretty easy. Today, front lines can change quickly, and war can spring up in lots of places. So, what does it bring? Well, here are women policemen. Why? Free up the men policemen. Okay. Some of these women have lost their husbands and they need a job. They have to support their families. So there's a labor shortage. And Russia is going to be, under the Soviet Union, the first Western government to give women the voting rights. 1917. Very progressive. Remember, we were looking at England, and they slowly give women the right to vote. They only give the married women over a certain age, and it slowly trickles down. Remember, America will not do this till 1920 after the war. Remember, we're celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of women in America being able to vote. So Russia is way ahead on this one. We often talk about Russia being 100 years behind. Well, they're on the cutting edge of this. And there's some women who fight in the war. Just some interesting stories about women in war. This is a Romanian woman who joins the Romanian army. She actually becomes a second lieutenant and is given command of a platoon of men. She'll be killed in battle against the Germans, and her dying words are, "Forward, men, I am still with you." In Romania today, she's seen as a heroine. Or you've got people in the Americans, right? Loretta Perfectus Walsh, the first active duty Navy woman. She's the first woman to serve in any of the U.S. Armed Forces other than a nurse. She will enlist and become a petty officer and later a yeoman. Opal May Johnson, she joins the Marines, right? 305 women will enlist in the Marine Corps. Again, they're doing non-combat roles. Or here's an interesting case. Here is Maria Lentivana Bakavera. She's a Russian woman who fights in World War I. When the war starts, she leaves her husband and joins a reserve battalion with permission of Tsar Nicholas II. She's wounded. She's decorated for bravery. She fights for the motherland. The problem is she does it under the Tsar. So when the Soviets come to power, that's going to be a problem. She is assigned to create an all-female combat unit under the Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky. Now, we're going to run into Kerensky again. I mentioned him earlier. The first Russian women's battalion of death, right? Well, the problem is when the Bolsheviks come to power, they're going to execute her because she fought for the Tsar in his army. So what about the aftermath of the war? How does all this wind down? Well, there's an armistice. There's a ceasing of fighting. Now, how do we get to peace? That's going to take longer. So there's going to be a press conference in Paris with the Big Four. Now, notice this is different than the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Notice there's no Austria-Hungary invited. Germany is not invited. Japan, who's an ally, actually comes but is somewhat slighted and leaves. So England, Italy, France, and America, not even on the continent, one of their first forays into world diplomacy. They have been kind of working at it a little bit. They're all going to sit down and decide what Europe should look like. Wilson comes with a plan. Wilson, again, the outsider, comes with this great plan. He's got these 14 points that if Europe will do these things, everything will be better. Well, we've seen that before. The Congress of Vienna, here is the plan. One of Wilson's plan is a continuation of that idea of coming together to discuss problems. And he comes up with this called the League of Nations. That nations should never have to fight a war like this again. Remember, this is called the war to end all wars. That they could sit down and talk it out. And if someone gets out of line, the other countries would put them back in line. This is Wilson's baby. He's even willing to give away some of the other points to make sure this happens. The irony is the United States will not join. So let's look at some of these ideas. Wilson again delivers a speech to Congress January 8, 1918, talking about these 14 points, and he will promote this League of Nations. What are these points? Well, just briefly, they're ideas like open diplomacy, no more secret alliances. Remember the beginning of the war? Freedom of the seas. Well, Great Britain's not so sure about that one. Free trade. Again, America's not so sure about that one. How do we protect our industry? Remember, tariffs have been a big deal. Countries would reduce their colonies. Ooh, how's France going to see that? And we would have international control of colonies, and eventually they would become countries. Remember, we've gone to make the world safe for democracy. Let people choose their government. Well, What about that? Is that what's going to happen? Remember, only France has an elected president. Germany's got one, but they're on the other side. Everyone else has been a monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. But this League of Nations, this idea that they could work together collectively to maintain the balance of power. Remember, it had worked after the Napoleonic campaigns. Remember when they met at the Congress of Vienna? There is peace for 90 plus years in Europe. So can't we do it again? Well, here's Wilson, and he's going to give this great speech. Here are his 14 points. You do not have to memorize them, but I do want you to look at them. Again, no secret diplomacy, freedom of the seas, trade barriers, reduce armaments. Let's cut back on the amount of weapons we have. Think about colonies. What do we do about Russia? Now, we haven't talked about what happened when everything goes down in Russia, but we will. What about make sure Belgium comes back as a country? The Germans had invaded it, still controlled it. What about French territory and Alsace-Lorraine? Yeah, there's Alsace-Lorraine. That's something the French have been pounding into their people that it was theirs, and they should get it back. What about new boundaries for Italy? Can it have that top part and take it away from Austria? What about other nation groups? What about the nation groups inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Let's break it up. Let's make them countries. What about minorities in Turkey? Yeah, the Armenians, right? What about bringing Poland back? Yeah, let's make Poland a country again. And some other things there that I think you can see. So again, really is going to change the landscape, literally. Maps, geography, nationalism, the idea that Europe might have different governments. So they get to the Treaty of Versailles. And Wilson's got all these great ideas, right? Well, what happens? Well, that doesn't get included. And that doesn't get included. And that doesn't get included. Germany will be disarmed, and they actually have to pay for this war. Now, they've already paid, but they're going to pay even more. Germany will lose its colonies, but not anybody else. As a matter of fact, those colonies will be given away to those that help the Allies. And new countries will be formed and given democratic governments. Where will that happen? In Central Europe, as they take land away from the Austro-Hungarians and parts of Germany and even some of Russia. And yes, they will have a League of Nations. So Wilson trades these other things for what he considers the most important, the League of Nations. And they will sign the Treaty of Versailles, June 28th. Yes, the war ended November 11th. Remember, 1918. But the treaty will not be signed. It will be signed at Versailles. Once again, Paris and the French are right in the center of world affairs. There you can see some of the things they talked about. Political clauses, German rights, armaments. What about prisoners of war and where to bury some of these people? What about financial issues? And they are going to divide up Europe with a totally new map. Guys, Europe will look different. It gets much more complicated after 1919. So in 1914, there were major powers. You can see there in pink, the central powers. They run right down the center of Europe. And then you see the Allies, and again, Russia drops out. Well, what if we take some of that land and reapportion it to other groups? So, Europe before 1919, right? There's Germany and there's Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's Belgium, there's France, there's Spain, there's Portugal, there's England. Well, as we can now look, whoa, did you see it? Notice land is being taken away from Germany. Notice Germany's actually going to be split up so Poland can have a port. Kind of keep that in mind as we head into World War II in not too long. Notice the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be broken up. It never becomes what it thought it would. The Habsburgs are done. So, Germany's going to lose some land. Can you guess what that little area there is? Yes, Alsace-Lorraine. There's going to be a demilitarized zone. Germany, even though it's going to have a reduced military, can't even have troops near the French border. And so we go from this, again, the central powers right there down the center of Europe. And we'll wind up with this. We'll wind up with this. Do notice on this map the Middle East. As the Ottoman Empire falls apart, England becomes a major player in this part of the world, and so we're going to see areas formed. So there are your new countries: Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, separate, Yugoslavia, Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Turkey, and Iraq. And today, some of those places are still in the news. Some of these have even broken up and are smaller countries today. Now, this is the big one. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Someone has to take responsibility for this action. Well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire has been broken up. Remember, they are the ones that declared war on Serbia and kind of kicked the whole thing off. Well, they're done. So who gets the blame? Germany and her allies. Notice Germany is listed first here. It's Germany will accept. Now, they're not at the table when this is written. They don't get a vote in this. Not only will they accept the guilt clause, they will have to pay for the war. What about Africa? Well, Germany, you're going to lose your colonies. And so that's what happens. And so they're going to be divided between Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and Italy. The Ottoman Empire will be broken up. We'll wind up with Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and those places are still in the news today, and it all goes back. A very complicated history in the Middle East. And Wilson will return home to he's a Democrat, to a Senate ruled by Republicans. And he will kind of have a nemesis there, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who will say that, no, we are not going to join the League of Nations. The League of Nations might drag us into a war, and it is Congress's job to declare war. It's in our Constitution. What if we get involved in a conflict that doesn't matter to us? What about the Monroe Doctrine, right? What if a conflict breaks out here? It's our job to stop those conflicts on this side of the world, not Europeans or this League of Nations. So, this is what they are concerned about in the League, at least the Americans back home, is that the League of Nations can take action against aggressive nations. And Senator Henry Cabot Lodge is going to have problems with the League of Nations, the LON, the LON, because it's Congress that declares war. And what if the U.S. got involved in war with no self-interest? Well, there you go. Not interested in peace, right? Interested in something we can get out of it. What about the Monroe Doctrine? And again, there's no guarantee that this will be a lasting peace. So it goes against Washington's speech. Remember, you may have go back to 8th grade, and we'll talk about it in APUSH next year. Washington warned the country of two things: political parties, well, they're pretty set in America at this time period, and foreign entanglements. Our job was to go to Europe, stop the war, and come home. And that's exactly what we'll do. We'll become isolationist. Why should we stay involved in world affairs? So here's the League. America will have a representative, but is not an official member. And these are all the countries. We'll start looking at some of those blue writings. What happens when people leave the League? Can you make someone stay? What happens when they are taken over by another country in a depression and there's no one able to put an army up to stop it? What happens when you get expelled? Look what happens to USSR. And we'll talk about this treaty they make with Germany in the future. What happens if someone does something and nobody says anything about it? So again, they were trying. This is a model for what will be the United Nations, but it is the League of Nations. And there are your members. Remember, lots of colonies. Well, what about memorializing the war? How do we memorialize the war? Well, that is Memorial Day. Memorial Day is observed in November to not only honor this war, but all wars. It starts to honor World War I, and then other wars have been joined in there. It was Armistice Day. It was Armistice Day. Today we celebrate, or I shouldn't say celebrate, we commemorate the end of wars and those who fight in those wars. We call it Veterans Day, right? We remember our veterans, those who went forth and took the war to other places to make America safe, to make the world safe for democracy. That'll happen after World War II. Again, I told you, Australia and New Zealand, big deal to get involved in a world idea. And so, they will have Anzac Day, right? They honor their troops who died at Gallipoli. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of World War I. This is what we're going to talk about next when we meet as a class. We're going to talk about what happened to Russia. How did it go from Tsar to Lenin? How did it go from a very strict autocratic rule to this new idea of communism? You've read Animal Farm. You've kind of seen a little story of how that happens. That's what we're going to talk about when we get together on Tuesday. So I hope you'll join us for our live Zoom meeting. This was the end of World War I. Read your book. I'll talk to you a little bit about the upcoming AP exam and look forward to seeing you then. You guys be safe and wash your hands.